Welcome to The Bid, where we break down what's happening in the markets and explore the forces changing the economy and finance. I'm Oscar Pulido.
And I'm Stevie Manns, The Bid's producer.
And as we wind down production for the summer, we're back with our Best of Summer series, where Stevie and I each pick a few of our favorite episodes from the past year to revisit while we take a little time off.
I know, it's what summer's all about. That's right, we've had some incredible conversations this year, and I always love this summer series where we take some time to reflect back on the episodes that really stuck with us. So Oscar, you're up first. What is your pick?
Well, usually every year I have to think a little bit about some of my favorite episodes, but this year it's really easy with the first choice, and that is the episode that we did in Davos. It was the one with Philipp Hildebrand and Tom Donilon, titled A Macro and Geopolitical Outlook, live from Davos. It was really memorable. Just, first of all, Stevie, for you and I to go all the way to Switzerland to find our way to this small town in the Swiss Alps where the World Economic Forum takes place. I don't know about you, but I've always seen headlines or clips about it on TV in years past, but to be on the ground was fascinating. Philipp and Tom had spent 4 days already on the ground. They're talking to policymakers and world leaders. And I remember in the conversation, we were talking about things like the Trump administration, which had just been sworn in that week. And we were already starting to see some executive orders coming out of the White House. We talked about Europe as a region and the need for Europe to become more unified as an economic bloc. We talked about AI and just how persistent of a theme that was. In fact, when you and I pulled into Davos, and as we were making our way through the streets, we started to see the various companies and the pavilions that they occupied along the street. And a lot of them were technology companies. So to me, those topics were interesting then, but have really foreshadowed many of the episodes that we have then done over the course of 2025.
Right. And as you said, this little town of Davos was completely taken over by companies, by countries, in fact, who were also there. It was such a memorable moment. And I will also never forget having to run the length of that whole town to find the audio engineer because I had an issue getting the audio files and this episode had to go out the next day. So note to self, if we do go next year, and fingers crossed, I will do my best to do some high altitude training before we go.
There's definitely a lot of favorite parts about this episode that our audience will never know about. You've touched on some of that, which was just the logistics and the time pressure to get this episode out on time so people could listen to it. So why don't we take a listen? Philipp and Tom, thank you so much for joining us on The Bid.
Great to be here, Oscar.
Thank you, Oscar. It's good to be here with Philipp.
So we're in Davos, Switzerland. We're here at the site of the World Economic Forum. This is an annual event that has occurred in Davos for over 50 years. So Philipp, I know you've been coming to this event for many years. And for people who are not familiar with Davos and the forum, what would you tell them about the significance of this event and how has it evolved over the years?
Yeah, so it's actually been going on for many decades. 1971 is the origin. It was called something else. It was called the European Management Symposium. And the idea at the time was to bring in the kind of Harvard Business School and other business schools insights on how to conduct businesses effectively to Europe. The original idea of Professor Schwab was to bring in these American management theories that were emerging at the time in the 60s and 70s and expose Europe to it, which is why it was called European Management Symposium. It was very small. Many of the meetings were on the ski pistes. Even when I started coming in the 80s, many of the meetings were kind of up on the mountains, actually, and people came in ski boots and would then ski. So it was a lot less corporate than it is today. And then in the 80s, it kind of shifted to becoming much more of a global political economy, politics, geopolitics, economics context, and has remained. It has become a very important gathering place and a kind of networking, exchanging of information platform. For many years, in many ways, it was unique. Today, you certainly have some competing platforms in the world, but it has remained, I think, an unusual and very special platform and very valuable for Switzerland.
It's fascinating to hear how it's evolved over many decades. And you mentioned the meetings used to be in the mountains because, in fact, Davos is the highest city in all of Europe from an elevation perspective. So we are surrounded by mountains, and it's a fascinating picture as people are walking through the streets. You've been busy in conversations this week. What are you hearing? What has the mood been like? What are some of the impressions that you're taking away?
I think there's sort of three big themes. The biggest one is the implications of the new administration. So I think there was an intense focus on What does it mean for the world? How does it change the structure of the global economy, the inflation outlook, etc.? The second theme, not surprisingly, since there are a lot of Europeans here, we are in Europe, is the question of how does Europe respond to this? What are the implications of it? Can Europe rise to this occasion? And if so, how? Including the geopolitical context of the Ukraine war, of course. And then I would say the third big theme is the extraordinary developments around AI. First of all, just what does it mean? Fascinating discussions here on the implications on cancer research, on research generally, how much research has advanced as a result of AI. But of course, also how it will impact the global economy, how it will impact growth. What does it mean for capital markets? How does it impact investments that are going to be made on a vast scale for data centers, for the energy that will be needed to fuel the data centers that are needed in order to produce the AI? So to me, those were kind of the three broad themes that dominated most discussions.
And you may not have done this intentionally, but some of the themes you're mentioning are some of the mega forces that we talk about on the podcast. Tom, you're the chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute. So I'd love to get your impressions and your takeaways.
So I'll say a couple of things. Number one is a kind of reflection of the continued relative advantage of the United States in terms of its economic position, its geopolitical position, but also, as Philipp was alluding to, its position on technology as a leader across the value chain, particularly in AI, and other technologies as well, but especially AI. Second is a lot of anticipation here about what the new administration means for the global economy, for global geopolitics. We were here as President Trump was being inaugurated, and he issued, of course, on his first couple of days in office, a blizzard of announcements and executive actions and steps that the government is going to take, bring about some fundamental change. And of course, it's natural that there be a lot of discussion here about what does that mean for regions in the world, the global economy, different countries in the world. On technology, I agree. You see these various technologies evolve in their importance in the world at Davos, right? You can see, and you can almost judge by the storefronts, right, as you go down the promenade here. And obviously, our artificial intelligence is now front and center in all its dimensions, as Philipp was saying. The core technology, the models, the hardware, but also very importantly, the infrastructure on which it's going to be built. One dynamic that wasn't here in full is the U.S.-China or the Western-China dynamic. That wasn't really a big point of discussion, but that obviously remains the most important strategic dynamic in the world. And there wasn't a lot of presence here from China. There wasn't really a way to talk to the Chinese about where they are in their development on artificial intelligence, right? Because, of course, one of the principal competitions geopolitically in the world right now is the geopolitical competition around technology between the United States and China.
I think, Tom, this is partly a problem that the forum has, or a challenge. And of course, it reflects, in a sense, globalization, the fact that we are in a fragmented world. And if you look at the membership here of the people attending or the composition, it has become less global. There's no question about it. As we live in this fragmented world, in some ways you could argue you actually need more places that can bring all the parts together again. And this is one of the questions the forum will have to really ask itself. Can it play that role to, in a sense, be the reconvener in a world that is less globalized than it used to be?
And Tom, you have a ton of experience in your career understanding geopolitics at a broad level. So you've both touched on the fact that it was a busy week in the world, not just because of the forum, but because of the inauguration of a new administration in the U.S. Tom, what is that geopolitical backdrop that the new U.S. administration is stepping into?
It's a very different world that President Trump comes into in his second term. Very different than the world he left across a number of dimensions. Philipp, I think, accurately said the principal dimension is fragmentation in the world. There has been increasing fragmentation and instability in the world since President Trump's last time in office, building out blocks, if you will, of countries that are increasingly facing off against each other across a number of dimensions. You also see a significant decrease in the coordination and cooperation among the important powers in the world. And I think that's an increasingly difficult problem in the world and one that's changed over the last really half decade or so. We're also, as I said, in the midst of a really increasing important and deep and epic, if you will, competition on technology between the United States and China. A competition over trying to seize the commanding heights, the leadership of key technologies, especially artificial intelligence, which is seen as being really important for the future, both in military applications, but also very importantly in economic applications. That competition, I think, is really front and center. The world's a lot more protectionist, I think. We haven't entered into an age of full-on deglobalization. That's not true. But globalization has been significantly changed, and we do see significant changes in terms of protectionism and mercantilism around the world. And we'll have to see U.S. policy again going forward here with respect to what does an America First foreign policy mean in terms of international economic relationships. So we'll see a lot of that. It's a world, and we saw this in 2024, especially with this great year of elections, where half the world went to vote. I think there were over 70 elections on a national level in the world in 2024. And incumbents really were badly battered. And that's a result of a lot of dynamics in the world, including inflation, including coming out of the COVID crisis, but also this kind of geopolitical tensions as well. There are two hot regional wars underway today that weren't underway in 2020 in Ukraine and in the Middle East. So it's a very different world today, very different than the world he left.
So there's a lot going on around the world. There's a lot of change. Maybe if I could switch gears and we could talk about the economy. But Philipp, when you think about the economic outlook for 2025, what are you keeping an eye on here in this year ahead?
To me, the most important thing is to think about how these forces that we've talked about and a few others are foundationally changing the structure of the economy. I think we need to shift from a perspective which would have been the traditional way you think about an economy over the last few decades, including when I was in central banking. You think about cyclical upswings, cyclical downswings, how you stabilize things through policy, whether it's monetary or fiscal. In that paradigm, you lived in a world where you had these cyclical fluctuations, and around it, you try to optimize policy to create the best possible output, best possible employment, while preserving price stability. It seems to me that we're now in a much more profound transformation of the world economy. We have a deep structural aging dynamic that's weighing on the economy, which has profound implications on the available labor force. We have this technology revolution, or what's being called here the intelligence revolution, in a sense, as the next step in a sequence. And some people would argue that perhaps the most significant step in the sequence of technological revolutions that we've had over centuries, that this is sort of the ultimate step into the age of intelligence. We have the very unusual geopolitical landscape that Tom just described. And you have, of course, the transformation around the energy system linked to innovation, but also to climate change. And you take all these things together, and it suggests to me that this is not about just cyclical fluctuations. The question here is not whether we're going to be in an upswing or a downswing, whether interest rates go up a bit or down. This is about what do these forces do to the structure of the economy. And when I take them on balance, these are mostly what we call in economics supply shocks, in a sense, that constrain the production capacity. It makes it less efficient when you have to operate in a fragmented world. And so on balance, what these forces tell me is that we're moving to a world where we're going to have sticky inflation, and central banks will struggle to get inflation to the target. We'll have higher rates as a result. In a world with very high debt stock, that's a very important piece of it. We've never really had this extremely high debt stock across the world. In a world where you have higher interest rates, higher inflation on average, that creates fragility around debt sustainability, volatility in financial markets, and simply more uncertainty. And I do believe, although it's always a risky thing to say this time is different, but it does seem to me, this is in my lifetime certainly, these are changes that we haven't really seen like this in the context of how they impact the very structure of the economy, as opposed to just impacting the cycle. Christine Lagarde today, or yesterday, I guess, referred to this being an existential moment for Europe. I think you could argue that's true for almost any region.
Yeah, it's interesting. In the context, I think it is interesting because there's also in the context of lack of coordination among a lot of the important global players. At the time of the great financial crisis, obviously in 2008, 2009, there was a truly global cooperation to address the challenges that the world faced. You won't have that today, I fear, if we got to a crisis. That's the first point. The second is, boy, the world's making a big bet on artificial intelligence. It is seen, as I said earlier, as being profoundly important for national advantage, and I'm sure it will be in military affairs, but also in economic affairs. And that really is, I think, Philipp, it's fair to say, that's the big growth bet.
Tom, Philipp has mentioned that where we are right now in the global economy, and it's important to see how countries are going to respond, and not just in the short term, but they're thinking about how to enact policies or think about longer term time periods. Coming back to, we have a new administration in the U.S. Like, what do you think are going to be some of the core focuses for the administration now?
Yeah, well, Oscar, it's early days. We're only a few days into the Trump administration. I'd say a couple of things. One is it was, as in terms of intensity and numbers of actions, as intense as we've ever seen a president come in, frankly, in terms of steps he's taken, announcements he's taken. I think his priorities are pretty clear. And a lot of them have been priorities for a long time. I think he'll start with trade and economics. And this has been a focus of President Trump's really since the 1980s. And he's been very focused on the issue of tariffs since the 1980s. He was focused on it in his first term as president. During the campaign for president this time around, he talked about it a lot. And I think you'll see him move forward with respect to tariff as an important tool of the United States economic policy. Didn't talk about it extensively in his inaugural address. He did put forth a kind of a broad executive order to study a range of potential economic steps, including tariffs in a lot of situations around the world. And indeed, even since the inaugural address, he's talked about implementing tariffs in a number of places already with Canada, Mexico, and China, and even most recently, Russia, if President Putin doesn't bring the Russians to the table to discuss the war and a peace settlement in Ukraine. And what I think it reflects is his view that tariffs are the most important tool he has in his foreign policy toolkit at this point. It's a tool, he sees them as a tool of general application. And so you see him talk about tariffs as a way to address the bilateral trade deficit that might exist between one country and another. It's a way to address immigration issues. I think the second is immigration. Again, it's been a long-time interest of President Trump's, a long-time issue that he's talked about again for decades. He's declared an emergency at the southern border in the United States and the border between the United States and Mexico. He has already taken a number of steps to try to reduce as much as possible the flow of migrants between Mexico and the United States, and indeed from the rest of the world into the United States. So clearly trade, tariffs, immigration. And then there are the two hot wars we've talked about in the world, and one in the Middle East, obviously, which now we're in a 6-week ceasefire at the war in Gaza. And I think you'll see a strong effort there to try to extend that ceasefire. It's going to be a challenge to keep all that together. But I think that'll be a focus. The Ukraine situation, I think it'll be a focus as well of his administration. He promised during the campaign to bring it to a close quickly. Obviously, it'll be a challenge, and we're seeing some of the challenge now through his communication publicly, at least with President Putin in the last day or so. And then I think China. It's the most important strategic relationship in the world. It's the most competitive. It's competitive across a whole range of dimensions. We'll have to see where that goes. I do expect there'll be some movement on tariffs with respect to China, but there's a whole range of other issues. He's put together a team who are pretty tough on China in terms of policy. But I think you look at his record, you look at his longtime interests, you look at his track record in his first term, and you can predict some of the major areas, I think, which will be the focus of his foreign policy.
We've talked a lot about the U.S., but we're in Europe. Maybe we could come back to Europe for a second. And Philipp, actually last year you talked about there being a lot of elections. Germany, which is the largest economy in Europe, goes to vote next month. Now, that's because Chancellor Scholz lost the vote of no confidence in December, and that's why Germans are voting next month for new leadership. Talk to us a little bit about the importance of that election.
Well, it's incredibly important, but I'd say even more important is how Europe together responds to these challenges that Tom lays out. This is a very different world than the traditional post-World War II, Bretton Woods type of system that we all grew up in. This is now a world with intense competition, confrontation, in some cases, actual wars. There's an enormous amount at stake. There is the fight for the commanding heights of technology, which people generally believe is going to, again, impact, depending where you end up in that fight, is going to really potentially impact your growth path in a very dramatic way going forward. So it's an intensely competitive moment. And Germany, Europe, broadly speaking, is losing, I would argue, the digital war. I'm deliberately using this kind of language because I think that is the urgency of the matter. It is losing the technology war more broadly. Europe is also losing the energy war. It has really, of course, had to deal with this shock on the energy side as a result of the war. In some ways responded very well, better than many people would have predicted. There is no energy shortage problem this winter. There won't be one. But of course, the cost of energy continues to be significantly higher, in some cases 3 or 4 times that of the U.S. And that is a huge competitive disadvantage, particularly at a time when we're going to need an enormous amount of energy to fuel this intelligence age that I referred to earlier. And so how Europe responds to this pressure point, I think is a, as Christine said, she's essentially right. This is an existential question. And so the German election is a big part of it, but it's by no means the only part. I would say what you require is a forceful response on the competitive landscape. And so to me, the real question is, is this shock big enough to create a kind of one of those moments of really reorientation of Europe and of stepping up and responding in a forceful way so that you can essentially catch up in this big gap that has opened. I think the magic triangle, in a sense, will play out in this dynamic between technology, AI specifically on the one hand, capital markets to fund it. You need deep capital markets to fund it. This is one of the great advantages that the US has in this competitive context. It has these extraordinary capital markets that are so flexible, so deep, so responsive. And then energy. You need energy. So I think the kind of the holy trinity almost, as you think about a strategy to respond, are these three things. So the analogy I would put, and this is where I put the election in its proper context, in 1992, obviously the Soviet Union had collapsed, chaos prevailed in Eastern Europe, and the European Union stepped up dramatically by way of the Maastricht Treaty, which was ratified in 93, but agreed to in 92, as a way to sort of respond to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This laid the foundation for the euro and for the European Union as we know it today. That was an extraordinary moment in the history of Europe. It was a paradigmatic shift in the history, or a paradigmatic sort of leap in the history of European integration. And so to me, the question is, are we seeing something similar, the beginning of something similar, triggered this time not by the collapse of the Soviet Union, but by a radical change coming from the United States and a radical change in the overall geopolitical context that Tom explained. Now, the one, and here I end with the election. And to me, one of the questions is, with this election, can this be the beginning of sort of creating a similar moment with ultimately a similar dynamic where you reestablish the leadership of the Franco-German alliance? I think the jury is out. Is this shock big enough, in a sense, to get Europe to be jolted and respond in a way that it did in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I mean, it's clear from listening to both of you, we're at an inflection point for the global economy, whether that's what's happening in geopolitics, whether it's what's happening in technology. And so if you're an investor, perhaps a final question to both of you, what's the key consideration that they need to think about in their portfolios this year?
Well, I think right now it's pretty clear that there is tremendous optimism on the potential, this intelligence age revolution in the US in combination with the capital markets and cheap energy is fueling a lot of optimism in the US. So that's pretty clear. And the question is, can Europe respond? I would say overall, there are going to be great opportunities in investing. The US looks, despite all the concerns the world has, continues to look like a very attractive place for the reasons we discussed. And I think overall, you need to be prepared. My guess is sort of steady correlations that have in the past been quite conducive to investing successfully is perhaps something that we should sort of move away from, the assumption that we're going to have that, and instead expect the world to be volatile, expect there to be trade-offs. The trade policy is a perfect example. You can do tariffs. Of course you can if you're the United States, but it may lead to higher inflation. So one needs to really think carefully what you want to do and what the implications are on policy or in macroeconomics.
And Tom, what about you?
A couple of things I'd say. We've had obviously kind of an elevated geopolitical risk now for a period of time. Yet the global economy remains pretty resilient, agile. That's for a number of reasons. I think it has to do with continued growth in the United States. And even though there are challenges in China, there's continued growth in China. The tragic conflicts in the Middle East have remained, at least from the global economic perspective, contained. We've had a relatively benign energy situation in the world and well-supplied energy supply. We've had the protectionist dynamic kind of mitigated, I think, a bit by the role of connector countries, right, who operate between the major blocs. But so much is dependent going forward on these risk can be elevated but not striking out, right, and harming the global economy. And we'll be monitoring that, I think. That's an important thing for us to monitor and understand. And so much is dependent on policy and geopolitics right now. And that's what we're going to do at the BlackRock Investment Institute.
I know it's been a busy week for you guys, and it's been interesting. A lot of the themes that we've talked about on the bid over many months, AI, the need to be selective in your portfolios and be nimble, the fact that inflation might be more persistent. It sounds like those were themes that you also heard about here at the forum. Philipp, I should have mentioned you're actually in your home country.
I am. I've skied these mountains for many, many years and hope that perhaps tomorrow I'll get a run in the morning. It's clearing up as we see. It snowed a bit today, and I think we're going to have a spectacular morning tomorrow.
It's been nice to visit your home country, and it's been great to hear your insights. Thank you for sharing them, and especially thank you for sharing them on the bid.
Thank you, Oscar, and I'm glad you enjoyed your time up here.
I think I'll pass on going up into the mountains with Philipp.
Wow, Oscar, listening back, that really was a power episode. So what else do you take away from listening to that discussion back again?
Well, I agree. Listening to that episode again is a reminder of why it's one of my favorites. We talked about 2025 being an inflection point for markets, and we talked about things like inflation and geopolitical fragmentation, the AI revolution, and it really feels like this year has been an inflection point on many of those topics. Philipp also references the Holy Trinity, what he regards as the three things that are really important for economic regions to have, and he mentions technology, mentions capital markets, and he talks about energy as well. So I thought that was a really interesting way to frame what governments and policy leaders have to think about in terms of, are their economies positioned appropriately?
Right. And it was such a rare opportunity to hear from two of BlackRock's top thinkers unpack that landscape in real time. And in fact, Philipp has such a unique background being from Switzerland. He's been to Davos, I think, since he was probably yay high. And it was actually, fun fact, his first podcast appearance on any podcast ever. And he had so much fun, he wants to do it again. So we might have that dynamic duo back on the bid soon, I hope.
They both had a lot of fun. And I really appreciated the fact that they had already had a long week. We were recording it really late in the afternoon on a Thursday. And they came in great spirits. They delivered some great content that has stuck with me till this day. So we have a high bar to clear if we do go back next year, Stevie.
Did I ever tell you I asked Tom how he relaxes with all of the stuff that is happening in the world that he has to report on?
You did not. What did he say?
He said he loves to watch reality TV, which I find so surprising and endearing about him.
Well, he has an entertainment bug in him somewhere. Maybe that's why he enjoyed doing the podcast.
Sounds right.
We hope you enjoy revisiting these episodes as much as we did. We'll be back soon with fresh conversations. But until then, thanks for listening to The Bid. And don't forget to subscribe to The Bid wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Oscar Pulido.
And I'm Stevie Manns. We'll see you soon. This content is for informational purposes only and is not an offer or a solicitation. Reliance upon information in this material is at the sole discretion of the listener. In the UK and non-European Economic Area countries, this is authorised and regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. In the European Economic Area, this is authorised and regulated by the Netherlands Authority for the Financial Markets. Reference to the names of each company mentioned in this communication is merely for explaining the investment strategy and should not be construed as investment advice or investment recommendation of those companies. For full disclosures, go to blackrock.com/corporate/compliance/bid-disclosures.